Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back. I'm your host, Paul Barter. I thought I would try to surprise you this time on the Reinventing Parking podcast by talking about some less known parking reform ideas. There are 6 of them, so I will describe each one only briefly. First, what if we require private off-street parking to report regularly on usage levels? Second, should we turn every decent-sized building and its parking into a mini parking benefit district? Third, a project to make many city maps of the areas with paid parking. Fourth, an alternative to maximums. Make parking count as floor area. Fifth, a parking moratorium, or maybe even a parking drawdown. And finally, please abolish your parking mandates, but if you must have them, make them Japan style. These ideas would mostly complement our main parking reform agenda of abolishing minimums and getting the on-street parking prices right. But I think most of them will probably be new to you. In fact, most of them are untried and untested. Some are almost certainly politically unrealistic. But I do hope they are all thought-provoking. I hope that they will be interesting. And I hope some scrutiny and discussion will be able to make them better, or even just that they might prompt you to come up with better ideas. Before I start on the ideas themselves, I need to quickly explain the thinking behind them. For many people, any need to ration parking with fees seems like an unnatural aberration. Most motorists expect free-of-charge parking and plentiful parking at the end of most trips. These expectations are not really natural. They've been shaped by decades of huge official efforts to boost parking supply. But if those are your views, then the ideas in this episode are going to seem shocking or even evil-sounding. How could we think such things? Well, I can't speak for all parking reformers, but many parking reform efforts, mine included, have a vision for how parking can and should work. In that vision, the users of parking and not everyone else will be the ones to cover its costs. Governments will stop boosting parking supply and will take care not to allow oversupply. Much less space will be devoted to parking and more will be for more important things, such as gardens, places to play, bicycle lanes, bus lanes, etc., etc. Parking regulations will not be a barrier to affordable housing or to corner stores. But motorists will not suffer from parking hassles. Paid parking with appropriate prices that vary from place to place will ration the use of the remaining parking, and there will still be lots of parking. Parking will no longer undermine the ability of diverse mobility options to flourish and serve us well. Public transport will do better. There will be somewhat less traffic, which would have huge benefits. Car ownership might be a bit lower, but most people will feel better about their urban mobility options than they do now. If that vision for parking sounds good to you, then listen on, because from now on in this episode, I'm going to assume you're on board with it. Let's get started. The first idea I want to mention actually came up in the December 2023 episode in my conversation with Evan Golden from the company Parkade. We were talking about the surprising fact that there is so much ignorance about how much or how little off-street private parking gets used. It's yet another astonishing way that parking supply policy is dysfunctional and lacks mechanisms to notice its mistakes, let alone correct them. Developers and financiers usually have some parking use data, but their samples are small, mostly just their own projects, and their learning cycle is slow or broken. As a result, many keep providing excessive parking even after parking mandates are abolished. Then came this exchange. Maybe the parking reform movement should add one more item to our agenda, which is mandating reporting of parking utilization rates just accelerate this understanding of the enormous glut that we've got in so many cities.
Paul, that's the best idea I have heard in a very long time. I love it. And it's exactly right. Paul, I guarantee you that if you went to the city council that forced this developer to build twice as much parking and you asked them how much parking was being used, they would have no idea. And so I absolutely love that idea.
By the way, the focus of this is private use parking, the off-street parking that is not open for public use. Information is less of a problem for public use parking. The basic idea here is that better information on parking usage would reduce the chances of wildly excessive parking supply and wildly deficient supply too, in case you're worried about that. Such parking usage information should improve parking policy. It should also improve private market decisions on parking. It might even better inform public opinion. I decided to share the idea in one of the Parking Reform Network's Slack channels, and I was happy to see that it generated some interesting discussion. Evan had suggested in the episode that state or national governments could impose the reporting mandate only on municipalities that impose parking mandates. Hopefully that would help discourage parking supply mandates. But people in the Slack said parking usage information is important even in places where parking mandates don't apply. For example, it could reassure people who fret about parking shortages, and real estate developers and financiers need parking usage information even more when there are no parking mandates, since they then have to decide for themselves how much parking to provide. But would it be too onerous and costly to require building owners to report regularly on their parking occupancy? One person pointed out that most cities don't even know how much off-street parking exists, let alone how well it is used. On the other hand, a city planner in the Slack discussion went the other way. Let me quote her. Typically, if a development is big enough to warrant a traffic study under the code, we ask for the parking occupant counts they collect too. If you start with stores over 100,000 square feet, just for example, since they are usually counting anyway, I think it could be a good way to introduce mandated usage counts, just like mandated traffic impact analyses. That way, you can ease into the idea without mandating it for small businesses, where you would get the most pushback. Someone else chipped in to say that a parking usage reporting requirement would not be very different from other data reporting requirements that some cities and states have imposed on building owners, such as rent registries. So maybe this would not be too onerous. By the way, a do-it-yourself version of this might be a useful action for parking reformers arguing against new parking supply. We could do counts of off-street private use parking occupancy rates. Gaining access might be tricky, but it would be a useful exercise to do in some neighborhood where everyone knows there's a parking shortage, but where we suspect that a lot of underused private parking exists. So, parking usage reporting. Maybe that's something for parking reformers to think about. Let's move on. The next idea is a bit more audacious. Most parking in most cities is free, and it's no secret that we parking reformers would like that to change. Yes, we can be irritating that way. But directly calling for more off-street parking to be priced is not a prominent part of our parking reform agenda. Sometimes I wonder if we should be more direct about parking fees, even if people will hate us for it. I had a little daydream that we could change public opinion about paid parking. In this fantasy, we would unironically push the idea of parking fee positivity, much like the Twitter personality James Medlock popularized the notion of tax positivity. Okay, maybe a little ironically. But like taxes, parking fees are unpopular but necessary. No one likes paying them, but they enable good things. Anyway, getting back to the policy idea. I was looking for a direct but politically possible way to expand off-street parking fees into areas where most parking is currently free of charge. Governments might try telling every owner of parking that they must now charge parking fees. Everyone would hate that, parking owners and motorists especially. It would be hard to get any cooperation. So, what if the government mandated or strongly encouraged all establishments with a decent sized parking facility that is free of charge to set up a fund that would pay for popular things? And the fund would have an important condition: the money must come from parking fees. This would essentially turn buildings and their previously free of charge parking into mini parking benefit districts. So let's call these funds off-street parking benefit funds. With this idea, we're hoping to get the owners of free of charge parking facilities to start charging for their parking, while giving the other key stakeholders associated with each building, such as residents, employees, or shopkeepers, reasons to like the parking fees. Why would they like them? Well, because the fees are funding something helpful. Well, of course, there are a lot of kinks to iron out. For example, what should parking benefit fund money be used for? Anything really, but we don't want them to just refund motorists their parking fees. We want the funds to help all of the residents or all of the employees and so on. It would probably be best to have representative committees decide, which is the recommendation for on-street parking benefit districts too. Does it seem rough that this idea would get parking owners charging parking fees only for that revenue to disappear again into the parking benefit fund? But remember, parking owners with free of charge parking are not seeing any parking revenue anyway. What do you think? Would encouraging or mandating parking benefit funds paid for by parking fees help extend the benefits of parking unbundling and explicit parking fees to more places? Is it politically possible? Or is there some fatal flaw that I've missed? Am I naive to think anything like this is possible? Let's move on again. The next parking reform idea is a less contentious mapping idea. The success of parking reform networks' mapping projects got me thinking. Would it be useful to create a large set of maps of many cities, highlighting all of the areas in each city that have any paid parking? How difficult would that be, I wonder? I see that various cities around the world do have online maps of where their paid street parking is. Some of these maps show garages too. But these maps can be hard to find, and some of them are difficult to use. So the suggestion here is for a large set of user-friendly and standardized maps for many cities which highlight where any paid parking at all exists, whether it's on-street parking fees or commercial off-street parking or unbundled residential parking or workplace parking fees. I have to admit that I don't have a strong sense of how useful such maps would be. But the maps that I could find online were fascinating, so I suspect that parking reformers might get a lot from being able to compare the geography of paid parking across many different cities all over the world. For example, cities like Austin, Texas, and Auckland in New Zealand may seem to have lots of paid parking in and around their central areas, but actually vast areas, most of their entire area, have no paid parking at all. Even a city like Berlin in Germany has paid on-street parking only in its core area. On the other extreme, Singapore, where I live, has paid parking almost everywhere. Would it be difficult to generate such a set of maps? Would it be worthwhile? I don't know. Are there any volunteers out there? I wonder if a company like Parkopedia might be willing to help. Anyway, let's move on. The idea in this section is about actively deterring excessive parking supply, but doing so in a less rigid way than parking maximums. Let me explain a little before I get to the idea. Conventional post-World War II parking policy treats off-street parking as a benefit to society that the market will inevitably underprovide. So governments need to jump in and promote, subsidize, or mandate to make sure there is enough parking. Today, most of us believe that off-street parking is not actually a social good to be promoted, but a costly private good, and that it also has large negative side effects, so that we should leave its provision to the private sector, and that there is more danger of over-provision than under-provision. Abolishing parking mandates is about refraining from boosting parking provision. But maybe we should go a little further than just refraining. After all, over-provision often still occurs, even in the absence of parking mandates. And in many places, we still have enormous parking gluts where we might want to speed up the process of reducing the parking supply. One approach to that is parking maximums. But parking maximums are controversial, even within the parking reform movement. Setting parking maximums is inevitably rather arbitrary, just like setting parking minimums is arbitrary. And parking maximums usually impose a hard, rigid limit on each project. It would be nice to have a less rigid way to discourage excessive parking supply. One idea is to levy a fee on every off-street parking space provided to discourage excessive provision. Mexico City has done something like that, although the actual implementation hasn't quite worked out, apparently. But here is another alternative to rigid maximums. Cities could make some or all off-street parking count as floor area in planning permission processes. And this idea has at least two real-world examples, Singapore and Sao Paulo. Until 2019, Singapore had parking minimums but no maximums. However, only parking up to the minimum requirement was exempted from counting as floor area. Parking in excess of the mandates was counted when a planning application was considered, at least for non-residential uses. Providing parking beyond the required minimums therefore had a very high opportunity cost for developers. To provide more parking, they would have to provide less office or less retail floor space, uses which had much higher returns than parking. Ouch! As a result, most of the real estate industry in Singapore used to think of the parking mandates, which were minimums at that time, more as targets. They were treated by the industry as both minimums and maximums at the same time. In Sao Paulo, something similar has been in place since 2014, with the explicit goal of discouraging excessive parking provision in buildings within transit corridors. Below a certain threshold provision level, parking does not count towards the allowed floor area ratio under the zoning rules. But parking beyond the threshold does count. Again, for parking spaces beyond the threshold, developers must now choose between parking spaces and more lucrative uses of that floor space. Furthermore, any development fees associated with building floor area in the city also applies to that excess parking. Exempting parking from counting as floor area is really a hidden subsidy and a boost to parking supply, and most cities around the world do this. Cities that have grown out of their old-fashioned desire for abundant parking should really consider eliminating that out-of-date parking supply boost by making parking count as floor area. I think this deserves some attention. It might be a promising and less rigid way to deter excessive parking provision than parking maximums. Let's move on again. Here is another idea for preventing excessive parking provision. What if a city or state declared a moratorium on expanding the supply of parking of all kinds within the existing built-up areas? Does that sound wacky? Does it sound politically hopeless? An even more ambitious variation would be a parking supply drawdown, aiming for an annual percentage reduction in parking supply. But let's focus mainly on the slightly less outrageous moratorium idea. Such a moratorium would not mean that no parking could be built at all. New parking would be allowed if it replaces existing parking capacity that gets closed or demolished. A simple way to implement this idea would be for any reductions in parking supply to be added to a tally of how much replacement parking can be built in each area. A city could then sell these as parking supply entitlements, and these entitlements could perhaps even be tradable. The overall supply of parking would not be allowed to increase, but a parking moratorium would change the parking supply situation gradually, development by development. And in growing cities, the parking supply would probably gradually drop within the existing built-up area, and especially relative to jobs and relative to populations. And this process would be quickest in areas with the most infill development. A moratorium would stop the expansion of a low productivity use of our urban space, which is already oversupplied in many places. And it would prompt parking problems to be more often tackled by managing the parking rather than building more parking. But those kinds of arguments seem dreary to most people. So if any city was to really do this, it had better be a part of some visionary plan, together with other efforts to shift away from cars. Obviously, a parking moratorium would only be possible in a city where that kind of thinking is popular enough. But if you're thinking that this would be politically impossible, well, maybe you're right, but many cities do in fact have policies that limit parking supply. Some cities have parking supply caps in their city's core areas. Such caps are more or less like downtown-only parking moratoriums, although they are sometimes set higher than the existing parking supply. For example, in 1975, Portland, Oregon set a limit on how many parking spaces can exist within the downtown area, although it has repeatedly raised that cap over the years. The city centres of Zurich in Switzerland and Copenhagen in Denmark even have policies aimed at a gradual decline in the supply of parking. They have parking drawdown policies. And of course, many cities around the world have parking maximums, in their downtown areas at least, and sometimes even in secondary business centres too. And many city centre maximums are actually tight enough that they are gradually reducing the parking supply in those areas. So limiting parking is a tried and tested policy, and it's not absolutely politically impossible. But it is currently mostly only done in city centres. The kind of parking moratorium I'm thinking about here would apply to the whole city, or I think it should. The idea is to confront car dependence. It should include the more car-dependent areas. It should include places where parking is currently free of charge. The places where such an abundance of parking exists that no one sees a need to ration any of it. So, is a citywide parking supply moratorium a promising idea? What about the similar idea of a gradual parking supply drawdown? I don't know. Maybe not right now, but if the situation changes, maybe these things would be worth discussing. Let's move on again. Now let's switch from a politically challenging idea, the parking moratorium, to one that is probably easier to get support for. In fact, this one is a compromise. It even falls short of the parking reform movement's usual recommendation of abolishing parking mandates. I don't really want you to compromise on that. Please do abolish your parking mandates. Abolish all of them. But, having said that, I know that abolishing all parking mandates still sounds too radical a step for many people in various places. The belief that parking shortage is the number one parking problem is especially common in low-income and middle-income countries, where vehicle ownership is still rising quickly and parking supply is rising much more slowly. But if you really must have parking mandates, please consider having parking mandates of a kind that are less harmful than they usually are. Adopting Japan's version of parking mandates, or something very similar, would be a big step in the right direction. How do I know Japan's parking mandates are not too harmful? Well, Japan's parking scene is already something like what parking reformers hope will eventually emerge in other countries if our reform agenda gets implemented. Unlike parking mandates in most countries, Japan's parking minimums are not an obstacle to the development or redevelopment of small buildings on small urban plots of land. As far as I can tell, parking complaints also don't seem to be a source of opposition to urban development proposals in Japan. They also don't seem to undermine private sector entrepreneurship in parking. Japan's cities have ubiquitous commercial priced parking of many kinds in most neighborhoods of most cities. A large proportion of parking in Japan is open to the public, even if it's privately owned and operated. And parking prices seem to vary in rough proportion to real estate values, ranging from expensive in the urban cores to cheap, but usually not free, in the outer suburban areas. That's surprising, since Japanese cities have not abolished their parking mandates. Okay, then what makes Japan-style parking mandates less harmful than those of most other countries? That's not obvious. Superficially, Japan's parking mandates are not so different from parking minimums all over the world. But when you look at them closely, you realize they don't even try to make every building provide enough parking to meet its own on-site parking demand. That's unusual. I'm not sure how conscious this was in Japan when they framed their version of parking mandates. But if any jurisdiction somewhere else in the world decided to adopt Japan-style parking minimums, it would need a change of mindset about what parking mandates are supposed to achieve. More on that in a minute. But first, what do Japanese parking mandates look like? The first key thing is that small buildings are not required to provide parking. Parking mandates for medium-sized buildings only gradually phase in for larger and larger buildings. The parking mandates are at full strength for large buildings with 5,000 or 6,000 square meters of floor space. The second key thing is that even at full strength, parking mandates in Japan are about a third of a parking space per 100 square meters of built floor area or so. They are much lower than most parking mandates in Western countries. 100 square meters is roughly 1,000 square feet, very, very roughly. Thirdly, Japanese parking mandates also have almost no variations from land use to land use or from place to place. As I said, they're not even trying to accurately work out how much parking each building might need. So that brings us back to the mindset issue. It is never clearly stated like this, but the implicit mindset behind these parking mandates seems to be this. The parking mandates don't really expect buildings to have enough on-site parking. It is understood that most parking will be paid public use parking in lots and in structures. Some of the public use parking is on-site with buildings, and some of it is standalone. Notice that this is a park once and walk style of thinking. But there are parking mandates for large buildings because there seems to be a worry that a large new building going up in an area might upset the demand-supply balance for parking in that area. Therefore, large buildings are required to reduce that risk by making a modest contribution to the parking in their area. By the way, a somewhat similar on-site parking as just a contribution to the local pool of parking way of thinking also seems to be the unspoken mindset in certain other places around the world too. This is most obvious in some of the dense inner urban areas in various countries. I'm thinking of places that still have parking mandates, but the mandates have been set at a low level and allow lots of exceptions or exemptions, such as exempting small lots or small buildings or old buildings, or making waivers of parking mandates very easy in various ways. So I still do say abolish your parking mandates if you can, but if you can't, Japan-style parking mandates would probably be a tolerable compromise for many places. So that's it. Phew, that's enough for this ideas episode. If you listened to the end, thank you. I'm very impressed. You stayed with me through such a wonkish episode. You deserve some kind of parking reform prize. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.